Listen, I know I've still got to finish a couple of the classic introductions videos, but Halloween is coming up. How am I supposed to connect the Kineticist to spooky season? What's the first question we've got? Is the Kineticist a spellcaster? I think I just got expert proficiency in the Mythos skill. Paizo, what have you done? Today we're going to talk about the Kineticist for Pathfinder 2nd Edition on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller that is struggling to decide which kinetic element is the most appealing to me. At first, I didn't think much of the wood element, but I've got to admit it's starting to grow on me. Listen, that may have been a terrible pun, but if I'd gone with the earth element instead, this video would have gotten off to a much rockier start. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome to Classic Introductions, a series where we take a look at different classes in tabletop RPGs and ask what do they offer players at the gaming table. This series is intended to be a big picture overview of different classes. Right now we're working through all of the options in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, where we explore how the different options for a given class fit inside of a game and dissect the particular play experience that you can expect should you choose a given class. Today we're taking a look at the Kineticist, which can be found starting on page 12 of the book Rage of Elements. This is a class that centers around the idea of controlling elemental magic and, well, doing all kinds of wild and crazy stuff with it. The Kineticist did appear in Pathfinder 1st Edition, where it was technically considered to be an occult class in that game. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, it's moved into its own unique niche, and if anything, it's probably closest to a primal class now, though as we dive into this, you're going to see that really defining what the Kineticist is a little bit tricky because it's very much its own unique creation in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I will say this, while I appreciated the power potential of the Kineticist in Pathfinder 1st Edition, it was always one of those classes that felt like it was more work than it was worth, and it was just one of those classes I never really wanted to dig into because of the overall complexity in 1E. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the Kineticist is still a somewhat complex class, but I feel like this time around, Paizo has really nailed the balance of complexity to output on a class and has created something that I think is a lot more approachable while still maintaining a lot of the fun and flavor that the 1E version of the Kineticist had. In other words, I really like Pathfinder 2E's take on the Kineticist, and this is a class I'm very happy to see brought into this edition of the game. Now, in this series, we examine every class through the lens of 7 specific questions. Number 1, what is the class role of the Kineticist? Number 2, how complex is the Kineticist, both to build and to play? Number 3, what are the key terms and concepts associated with the Kineticist? Number 4, what are the strengths of the Kineticist class? Number 5, what are the weaknesses of the Kineticist class? Number 6, what build options do you have if you choose to play a Kineticist? And then finally, number 7, how can I get the most out of the Kineticist in play? So in today's video, we're going to go through the Kineticist point by point. We're going to answer these different questions and take a big picture overview of what the Kineticist is and what you can expect from the Kineticist as a player. Now, allow me to say, this is not a deep dive into every single option that the Kineticist presents. in part because the Kineticist is a huge class. In Rage of Elements, there are 25 pages devoted just to the Kineticist because of the amount of content that goes into this particular class, and if I were to dive into every class feat, into every combination impulse, into every impulse and gate junction, the reality is we'd be here all day. So in this video, we will be talking about some of the general options that are available, but we're not going to go into every single detailed choice that you can potentially draw from. However, I will say this, I am going to link a couple of class guides in the video description that go into some more detail of individual options for the Kineticist, so if you want to read and research farther, that is available to you. Also, before we get into the video, it's time to do the usual YouTube stuff, but I will say that the Classic Introduction series is the most complex videos that I make. A lot of work goes into researching and scripting and recording and editing these videos. It is very time consuming, and so to that effect, anything that you can do to support the channel really does go a long way to encouraging me to create content like this. So yes, I know you've heard it before, but if you can like the video or share the video or subscribe to the channel, that really does mean a lot. If you jump down to the comments section and if you're part of the conversation, offer your tips and suggestions. And if you'd like to go farther in supporting the channel, you can also check out my free Discord or my Patreon. Both of those are linked in the video description. With all that out of the way, let's get started. Alright, so let's move to the first question in our video, which is, number one, what is the class role of the Kineticist? And let's just go ahead and admit that we're starting this conversation in a bit of a complex place because Paizo really goes out of their way to make the Kineticist complex. And allow me to say, I can see the reasoning that Paizo has for the design choices that they make with the Kineticist, but the easy joke here is the Kineticist a spellcaster? If you read the class description, they use magic, but the game also goes really far out of its way to tell you that the Kineticist does not use spells. They're called impulses, and there is a difference, no really. Okay, so it is way too early in this video to dive into counteract checks and counteract ranks and impulse attack rolls versus spell attack rolls and all of the particulars of what Paizo is trying to say here. Honestly, in describing the class role of the Kineticist, I feel like the easier thing to do here is to step outside of the terminology of Pathfinder 2e and look at the class through, I guess you could call it, more generic gaming terms. A lot of the guides that I've seen use terms like blaster or striker to describe the role of the Kineticist, and honestly, I think that's probably the best place to begin. That is kind of the core of what the Kineticist does in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The fantasy of the class is that you have a connection to the elemental planes, you have a gate to the planes that is tied to your body in some fashion, and you can essentially draw elemental power through this gate, bring it into this world, and then use that elemental power to do all kinds of crazy stuff. And in the particular context of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, all kinds of crazy stuff here basically means blasting people with elemental power. Yes, there are other options that you can get into, and I will say that the Kineticist is well designed in that it can often dabble in other roles beyond just blasting and striking. However, when it comes to the core of the Kineticist, whether you are launching fiery projectiles or summoning a massive earth hammer and smashing people with it, one way or another you really need to view this class through the lens of an offense-focused striker or blaster. You are here to deal damage and bring the hurt to your opponents. Kineticist really is a class that kind of weaves an interesting line between the distinctions of what it means to be a martial class and a spellcasting class. When you begin to dig into what this class does, you will find that the playstyle often mirrors the playstyle of a martial class, while using a lot of the damage and mechanical components you would associate with spellcaster spells. The best description I have of the playstyle of the Kineticist, it's almost like it's a weird mix of the swashbuckler and an arcane blaster caster. Is that description as clear as mud? Well, let's move on to question number 2 in this video and talk about my complexity ratings for the Kineticist. I don't think it will surprise anyone watching this video to hear that I consider the Kineticist to be a pretty complex class overall. It's easily one of the largest classes in the game, and that weird combination of martial and magical considerations causes this to be a class that just has a lot of nuance, a lot of particulars that you will need to examine and keep in mind when you're considering it, and that overall is going to cause the Kineticist to earn a higher complexity rating from me. Now I will say this, I don't think the Kineticist is the most complex or even in the top 3 of most complex classes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Overall, I'm going to split the Kineticist complexity rating into 2 parts. I'm going to give it a build complexity rating of 8 out of 10 and a play complexity rating of 7 out of 10. Essentially, this is a complex class, but I feel like a lot of that complexity is found in trying to build your character, and then once you build your character, it is going to get a little bit simpler going forward. Is it going to be as simple as something like a fighter or a rogue in play? Probably not, but it will get a little bit easier once you get past character creation. Now, before I say anything else on complexity, I do want to throw out my usual caveat here, which is, please do not use complexity as a reason not to play a class if you're interested in it. I have seen brand new players to Pathfinder 2nd Edition take some of the most complex classes in the game, like Oracle or Alchemist, and play them very effectively because they were interested in those concepts. After many, many years of gaming, I can say confidently, if you are interested in a character, that is going to outweigh the complexity of playing that character. You want to have a reasonable understanding of how much work goes into playing a given character, but if the flavor, if the mechanics, if there's something inside the class that speaks to you and makes you say, oh, this is interesting, by all means, I recommend giving the class a shot. As I mentioned earlier in this video, I think that the Pathfinder 2e Kineticist really comes together in paying you off for the overall complexity of the class that you have been given. So let's go back to those 2 scores I mentioned a moment ago, the build complexity of 8 out of 10 and the play complexity of 7 out of 10. I want to offer a couple of quick pointers to help you if you're approaching the Kineticist class. The Kineticist, as I've mentioned, is a very large class. 25 pages long in range of elements. It's a huge class. It has a ton of options. The big piece of advice I want to give you is this. Don't look at the whole class all at once. You're going to get overwhelmed. The Kineticist is very much designed where you build it in stages, and as you go past certain stages in building your Kineticist, it's going to open up certain options that you then get to pick from. Now, build options is question number 6, so we're not going to linger here too long, but as a quick example, at level 1 you can pick a single gate or a dual gate. That's 1 or 2 elements. That means that at first level, at least 4, if not 5 of the elements available to the Kineticist are not available to you. And those options essentially don't exist. And beyond all that, you're probably not going to look at anything with composite traits at level 1. Therefore, when you're building a level 1 Kineticist, there are significant chunks of the class that are essentially off the table during character creation. And I think when you realize that about the Kineticist, it makes the class easier to build. My advice is this: go through the process of the Kineticist slowly, step by step, and as you go through the different stages, just take note of which options are opened up to you and which options remain closed off. It'll be much easier for you to decide what you consider interesting and what you don't even need to think about at this particular point. Also, allow me to say, while this series doesn't do a lot about higher level builds for classes, I will say that the higher level builds of the Kineticist kind of follow this same principle. As you level up, you will get certain things that open up more options, but you are very unlikely to be in a situation where you have to consider the whole of the class all at once to figure out what you're going to do. If you take that approach of stages of building the Kineticist and options being opened, the Kineticist will remain complex, but I think it's a lot more manageable. Moving on to the playing the Kineticist side of things, later we're going to talk about a term called Overflow, and essentially what this means is, with the Kineticist, you're going to have super move options, and the balance of play for the Kineticist is deciding when do I stick to my basic techniques, and when do I want to risk going big with my elemental powers. This is why I mentioned the swashbuckler earlier, that tension between steady and reliable options versus big dramatic effects, and choosing when and how to use them. That's kind of the core of the Kineticist gameplay. I actually think one of the easiest questions in deciding is the Kineticist the right class for you. If the Swashbuckler's playstyle is something you enjoy, then I think the Kineticist could be very appealing. But if that balance of risk and reward is stressful to you, this might be a class worth avoiding. But now we come to question number 3, and this is going to be the heaviest part of this video. What are the key terms and concepts that you need to be familiar with if you're going to play a Kineticist? And I'll go ahead and tell you, there's a lot of stuff here. The Kineticist is a class that's going to come with generic options, elemental specific options, and then combination options that interweave multiple elements, and understanding the interplay between a lot of these different rules ideas is a big part of successfully playing the Kineticist. Now, one of the things that I really appreciate about Paizo in Pathfinder 2nd Edition is they do take the time to help highlight some of the important concepts you need to be aware of if you're choosing to play a given class. Every class comes with this convenient sidebar that tells you some of the most important key terms that you need to pay attention to, and if you study that sidebar, you can get a pretty quick idea of what the main ideas, main concepts of the class are going to be. And the Kineticist gets 2 sidebars. Seriously, the Kineticist on page 15 gets one of the longest class-specific sidebars in the game with 5 key terms you need to be aware of, and then when you flip the page, on page 17, you get another sidebar with 3 kind of rules clarification notes that you also want to know if you're going to play a Kineticist. There is a lot going on here, and then, as fans of this series know, yes, there's also content beyond these sidebars that I think a Kineticist player should be aware of, so there's a lot to dig through. Let's start with the content of the sidebars themselves and see what Paizo highlights when it comes to the Kineticist class. The first key term is Composite. And this is a relatively simple key term for the Kineticist. Composite basically means 2 elements in one effect. So if I have an ability that's combining air and earth into a single effect, that would be a composite ability, whether it's a composite blast, a composite impulse, whatever the case may be. When it comes to selecting a composite ability, the rules specifically note that in order to select that ability, your kinetic aura must have every single element available in the composite ability. So, for example, if you want a composite ability that mixes water and wood, then your kinetic aura must channel at least water and wood in order for you to access that ability. That's honestly pretty straightforward, and this goes back to that opening up options that I mentioned about character creation. One of your class abilities is called your kinetic aura. That's where you open up your elemental gate and let the energy through. Essentially, whatever elements you choose for your gate are going to be part of your aura, and that's going to guide which abilities you can select, whether they are regular abilities or composite abilities. The next key term is much more central to the class, and this is one that you'll need to spend some time making sure you understand. That's the impulse key term, and impulses are the magical actions that you take as a Kineticist. You are channeling elemental energy and using that to do different things in the world around you. Well, the things that you do are called impulses. whether it is shaping an element, blasting people with an element, or using some other composite ability that you've picked up. All of these things are considered impulses, and they represent your character actively shaping the elements around them. Now, because you are actively shaping the elements, there are a couple of requirements you want to keep in mind. Number one, your character must have at least one hand free in order to shape the elements. You can kind of flavor this like the elemental martial arts from Avatar: The Last Airbender, where the characters are moving their bodies in specific ways in order to channel and direct what the energy is going to do. That's kind of what's going on here. By having your hand free, you can control and direct where the elemental energy goes. Also, because you are controlling and directing the energy, that does mean that when you see the word impulse, that means it automatically has the concentrate trait unless some class ability removes concentrate from it. Basically, if you're going to be shaping a fire blast, you probably want to be paying attention to what you're doing and where that fire is going. The next key term that is mentioned is the Infusion key term, and honestly the Infusion key term is basically metamagic for the Kineticist. We've mentioned metamagic in many of the previous videos in this series. Metamagic is a tag that Paizo uses to allow spellcasters to play with the parameters of their spells. Infusion is kind of the same thing. It's a special action that the Kineticist performs before an impulse to modify what the impulse is going to do. Infusion and metamagic have essentially the same restrictions in that you must use the infusion immediately before the impulse. You can't put anything in between these two actions or you lose the benefit of the infusion. But other than that, you can really think of infusion and metamagic as the same thing. And as a side note here, for the Pathfinder 2e remaster, I think Paizo is going to be switching the term metamagic to spell shape. I haven't seen a formal announcement on that, but I do think that's the direction they're going. So it's possible that the terminology could shuffle around in the next couple of months. But if you are familiar with the rules on metamagic, the rules for infusion are much the same. Our next key term is Overflow, and Overflow is a special type of impulse that Kineticists can access that basically, these are your big dramatic moves as a Kineticist. You have your regular elemental blast, you have your regular effects, and then you have the moves that really tax what your character can do to their limit. When you use an Overflow ability, this is going to deactivate your Kinetic Aura. Thank you, Paizo. I've mentioned Kinetic Aura twice and we haven't even gotten to that ability yet. For now, just think of it this way. The Overflow is going to temporarily shut off your access to elemental magic, and before you can use any of your elemental impulses again, you're going to need to revitalize that connection because you just pushed that magical link that you have a little bit too far. Now, in terms of overall action economy, it's going to be very rare that this comes up, but this is distinctly called out in the rules. Overflow abilities are so taxing that your character can only ever use one Overflow ability in a given round. So even if you have a situation where you're able to use an Overflow ability and revitalize that connection to your elemental magic, should you still have some actions remaining, you're not going to be able to overflow a second time because you've just spent too much energy on that previous overflow effect. You must wait to a future round to use that again. Still, the intended mechanical niche of the overflow should be pretty obvious here. These are your big moves, your powerful attacks. These are the major abilities that you have as a Kineticist. They're very effective, but they do drain you a little bit when you use them. Moving on to our last official key term in the first sidebar, we have the stance key term, which is another key term that we've seen several times before with previous classes. A stance can be viewed as a particular way that your character approaches combat. You enter a stance and you're adopting a general strategy and a general position with your body that brings certain benefits but also has particular restrictions. It takes an action to enter a stance, and then once you enter a stance, you stay in that stance until either combat ends or you do something that breaks the restrictions of the stance. Stance abilities are explicitly called out as being encounter mode only options, so you can basically only use them when initiative has been rolled. And because of the focus that they require, you can only ever use a single stance in one round, meaning that if you want to switch to a different stance, you need to wait until the next round to do so. Generally speaking, stance abilities will be unlocked by taking particular Kineticist class feats, and each stance is going to have its own unique particular requirements, so you'll need to pay attention to those as you're selecting them. Still, overall, the stance keyword is going to function identically for the Kineticist as it would any other class in Pathfinder 2e. Moving on to the sidebar on page 17, this covers a few rules clarifications for the Kineticist, and these are just 3 things that you want to be aware of. A lot of them will ultimately boil down to Game Master interpretation. First up is a phrase that you may see with a lot of Kineticist impulses that say, made of an element. Essentially, this means that a target is composed primarily of the appropriate element in question. What it doesn't mean is that a target has some of that element present. For example, a wood elemental creature would be considered made of the wood element and could be affected by any impulse that says made of the wood element. However, let's say you had a druid that was walking around in special wood armor. Yes, they're wearing some wood armor, but the actual target, the druid themselves, is not made of the element, and therefore they couldn't be affected by an impulse that said made of the wood element. Again, this is largely going to be up to Game Master interpretation, but the distinguishing line here is the creature primarily composed of the element, or is there just some of the element present? And when it comes to the latter category, the game is being very clear that has gear of that element is not the same thing as made of that element. The next rules clarification that is given relates to kinetic aura, there it is again, and deals with the question of what happens to a creature when they happen to be standing inside of more than one kinetic aura at the same time. Now honestly, this is kind of a very niche consideration of the rules, because when we get into kinetic auras, there are going to be a lot of options here, and just because 2 Kineticists both have a kinetic aura, doesn't mean that those Kineticists have identical effects. Every Kineticist can potentially have a range of effects available, and if another creature is standing inside of multiple kinetic auras, they would get each individual effect that applies to them as normal. So if you have a fire aura over here and an air aura over here, and both of them have some particular effect to be aware of, the person standing in the middle of both auras would get both effects. The key detail here is you can't double up on the same effect if they would be present for some reason. So if you had a fire kineticist over here and a fire kineticist over here, both of them have their aura active and you've got someone in the middle, if there are identical effects in both auras, that effect would apply to the creature in the middle just once. Again, the particulars here are up to the Game Master, but you don't get to double up on particular effects, like maybe applying a particular weakness or something like that. The last rules clarification that's given relates to precious materials. As the Kineticist is going to be manipulating elemental things in the environment around them, it does raise the question about what kind of elemental materials are being manipulated, and the game goes out of its way to specify that the work of the Kineticist manipulates very basic materials, meaning that the Kineticist doesn't get a pass to magically summon precious materials just out of thin air. If you are playing a metal Kineticist, sure, you may be able to summon a metal spike to fling at your enemies, but that doesn't mean you just get to summon something like silver or adamantine to your side infinitely without any restrictions. The Kineticist abilities operate under the assumption that in the vast majority of cases you're working with very basic, non-precious materials for whatever it is you're trying to do. Now with that, we've covered all of the key terms and concepts that Paizo highlights in their sidebars, but before I dive into the specific class abilities that you need to know about, I do want to highlight one more area of the rules that you want to think about, and that is the rules for counteracting. Kineticist abilities are considered magical effects, so even though they are not spells, they can still be counteracted, sort of like a spell could be, so that does mean you will want to read up on the rules for counteracting and counteract rank, things like that. You will want to be familiar with how those work in case they do come up. However, the good news at this point is that kind of covers the broader rules elements of the game that you need to think about, and we're going to get to move into the actual class abilities. The Kineticist has a lot going on, but the positive side of that coin is a lot of the Kineticist is self-contained, and you don't have to reach out beyond the class very far in order to understand how they work. Get a grasp on what the Kineticist is doing, and you're going to have the class down. So let's go ahead and dive into the Kineticist class abilities, starting with the Channel Elements activity and the Kineticist Kinetic Aura, which we've already mentioned like 3 times in this video, so yeah, it's time to talk about it. Earlier I mentioned that every Kineticist has what's known as a kinetic gate that links their body to an elemental plane or possibly multiple elemental planes, allowing them to channel elemental magic. Now, the kinetic gate itself is really going to dive into the subclass or build options for the Kineticist, so we will return to the kinetic gate later, but the kinetic gate leads into a couple of important abilities, which are Channel Elements and Kinetic Aura. Channel Elements allows you to channel magical energy through your gate and create a kinetic aura of your particular elemental magic around you. Now, as a basic rule of playing a Kineticist, you cannot use any of your impulse abilities unless your kinetic aura is active. So if your kinetic aura is not active, then you spend 1 action and you channel elements, and when you do, elemental energy begins to swirl around you in a 10-foot radius. This elemental energy is going to correspond to any element that is connected to your gate, whether it's one element or multiple elements, they will all come through at the same time. And the visual effect of this is that the elements begin to whip around your body as a display of primal power. So if you're channeling air, air is going to whip around you. If you're channeling fire, you might have small bits of fire that are hovering around your body. You might have pieces of rock or metal that float around you, but essentially you have this area around you that shows that you are channeling elemental energy. Now I should note that your kinetic aura, at this point in character creation, is essentially cosmetic. It is a prerequisite to using your actual abilities. So you may have small bits of fire or stone that are fluttering around your character as a result of your kinetic aura, but it doesn't deal any appreciable damage to creatures that might be close to you. You may unlock other features for your kinetic aura as you gain Kineticist class abilities, but the basic version of the Kineticist aura gives you a visual manifestation of power and allows you to use your impulses, but that's it. As a result, you may look at Channel Elements and Kinetic Aura as a sort of action tax on the Kineticist class, but thankfully Paizo is reasonably generous here. When you use the Channel Elements ability, in addition to activating your Kinetic Aura, you can also use an additional ability alongside of it. You can either channel a 1-action Elemental Blast, or you can initiate a 1-action stance that you have from one of your class feats. So if your Kinetic Aura is down and you have to activate Channel Elements, yes, it's a little bit of an action tax, but you do get something out of activating Channel Elements, so it's not just a pure waste of one of your actions. One final thing I should note here, for the Kineticist, any stance ability that you have from your class feats, those are going to be tied very closely to your Kinetic Aura. So just like you need to have your Kinetic Aura active to use an impulse, you also have to have your Kinetic Aura active in order to maintain a stance that comes from a Kineticist class feat. So if your Kineticist aura goes away for any reason, not only does it block your ability to use impulses, but you also immediately end any stance that your character might be using. Okay, so now you've got your Kinetic Aura active, what can you actually do with your elemental magic? Well, let's start with the base Kinesis ability, which is a 2-action activity that allows you to manipulate a small amount of a basic element in or around you. You can use base Kinesis out to a range of 30 feet, and it comes with 3 particular options. It allows you to generate, move, or suppress any element associated with your kinetic aura. Generate means that you can conjure some of that element from its elemental plane and bring it to you, and then use it for whatever the normal use of that element might be. So, for example, if you need some air to breathe, you could conjure some air with base Kinesis, or if you needed to start a fire, you could generate some fire with base Kinesis and use it to light a fire. As noted from our sidebar discussion, the element that is generated is basic, so you're not going to get anything particularly precious from it, but you can conjure it to you. If you have an open hand, you can pick it up, you can use it however it would normally be used. It's there for you to use as you see fit. The next option is Move, which allows you to move any of the associated element up to 20 feet by sustaining this ability within the overall range of base Kinesis. You can move the fire or water around, levitate it, drop it, whatever you need to do. And then finally you have Suppress, which allows you to essentially destroy that particular element, again in a small space. So for example, you might snuff the flames on some candles or destroy the water that is sitting inside of a cup. Base Kinesis does note it only affects basic forms of elements, so when it comes to suppressing an element, you could evaporate water in a cup, but you couldn't destroy worked wood or stone in the form of a statue or a door or something like that. But essentially, base Kinesis is kind of minor elemental tricks out to a range of 30 feet, with the restriction that, at least at first level, you can only generate, move, or suppress elements up to light bulk. As you level up, you will get the ability to affect more and more of that element, but the amount grows slowly over time, and base Kinesis is never going to be the kind of dramatic, powerful effects that would allow you to damage enemies or inflict conditions, things like that. This is the minor magical tricks ability of the Kineticist class. However, when it comes to the tricks that a Kineticist can call upon, the ability that you're probably here for is Elemental Blast. This is a 1 or 2 action activity that allows you to, well, blast your enemies with elemental power. This is going to come with the attack, impulse, and primal traits, so those are things you're going to need to keep in mind, but you can think of this as a repeated use elemental attack that your Kineticist has access to that is going to correspond to one of the elements that you are channeling through your kinetic aura. And allow me to say up front that the Elemental Blast is a very flexible ability that is going to come with a lot of options. I've already mentioned that it's a 1 action or 2 action activity, meaning that you have a choice when you make an Elemental Blast whether you want to do a quick attack or whether you want to do a slower, more powerful attack. If you do the 2 action version of Elemental Blast, you actually add your Constitution modifier as bonus damage on top of the blast. However, that's not the only choice you get to make when you are making an Elemental Blast. Another choice you have available corresponds to the elements that you are connected through your gate. Now, if you only have a single element available, there's not going to be much of a choice here. If you can only access the element of fire, then you can only use Fire Elemental Blast. But if you have access to multiple elements, you can actually switch out which elements you use each time you call on Elemental Blast. So for example, if I have access to wood and air, I could make a wood blast on one turn and an air blast on the next. However, the choices go beyond even this, as every particular element is going to come with 2 options for the type of damage that it deals. So for example, if you have access to the air element, when you make an air elemental blast, it can deal air or electric damage. Now there is an exception here that fire can only deal fire damage, meaning that it is a little bit narrower than the other elements. But in general, what you can expect to see here is that each element is going to come with a physical damage type and possibly an energy damage type that can be directed at your foes. And we're not done with the choices, because you also have the choice when making an elemental blast of whether you want to throw that blast at range or use that blast as a sort of improvised melee weapon. Again, for imagery here, I'm going to call back to Avatar: The Last Airbender. If you imagine some of the scenes in that show where they conjure whips or swords that are made out of a particular element, that's kind of what's going on here. Your Kineticist can actually summon a melee version of the blast and use that in an up-close and personal fashion to attack your opponent. All of these options mix and mingle and play together, and you have several different things you have to keep track of when you're using Elemental Blast. Overall, this is a very versatile ability that should give you multiple ways to attack your foe, that should give you multiple damage types to use against them, and it is worth noting that different bonuses can stack together. So for example, if you're using a 2-action Elemental Blast, and you just so happen to make that a melee Elemental Blast, then you would get both your Constitution modifier and Strength modifier to the damage of that blast, representing the sheer amount of elemental power you're putting behind the blow. What's best in any given situation is obviously going to change, but this is a very flexible ability, it's a core part of the class, and it's something you're going to get a lot of mileage out of. But before we leave Elemental Blast, let's go ahead and talk about Impulse attack rolls and Impulse DCs, because the Kineticist has to be just a little bit weird here, in that while Impulses are not spells, the Impulse DCs and the Impulse attack rolls very much follow the formula you would expect for calculating a spell DC or a spell attack roll. This is an area where the Kineticist veers a little closer to spellcasters than martial characters, in that the formulas and overall math is going to look a lot more like what you would expect with a spellcasting character, but since Constitution is your key ability score, you're going to be using your Con modifier rather than any of your mental stats to figure out how powerful your Impulse attacks or Impulse DCs should be. That being said, since the Kineticist Impulses are not spells, they can actually get an item called a Gate Attenuator that gives them an item bonus to attack rolls with Elemental Blast, and that is something that every spellcaster in Pathfinder 2e is immediately jealous of. Now, for all of the flexibility that is built into the Elemental Blast ability, there is still a potential threat to the Kineticist that needs to be addressed, and that is, what does a Kineticist do when they go up against a creature that is made out of the element that they're focused on? So, for example, if you're a fire Kineticist and you go up against a fire elemental creature, what are you supposed to do? They're immune to fire damage. Well, that's where the next Kineticist ability comes in, called Extract Elements. This is a single action activity that allows you to target a particular elemental creature and attempt to pull some of their elemental energy out of them and mix it in with your own, thus effectively turning your elemental attacks into something that can damage them. Extract Elements has a range of 30 feet and allows the targeted creature to make a fortitude save. The base damage that it deals is pretty low. It's only 2d4 damage that will slowly scale up throughout the course of the game. But the only way for the targeted creature to completely avoid the effects of Extract Elements is if they roll a critical success on the saving throw. So if they get a success or lower, then you get to steal some of their energy away, and you can use that energy that you've stolen away from them to modify your own attacks. And there's a lot of details here. We're not going to deep dive into everything, but you can lower the target's resistances or remove their immunity and give them a less useful resistance in its place. Basically, Extract Elements is an action that exists to ensure that your Kineticist is not hamstrung because you went up against the wrong type of creature and your base class abilities just aren't appropriate to that creature. Now, Base Kinesis, Elemental Blast, and Extract Elements are going to be your 3 core Kineticist abilities. Those represent the main body of what you do, and from there, most of your options are going to be opened up through the different Kineticist class feats that you take. You will pick up new impulses, new options, based on what elements you have available to you, and we will talk about some of those build options when we get to section 6 of this video. But there is one aspect of building a Kineticist I would like to highlight here, and that is Impulse and Gate Junctions. Essentially, you can think of Impulse and Gate Junctions as specializations. When you are building your Kineticist, at different points you're going to have the opportunity to choose whether you want to specialize in an element or broaden the scope of elements that you have access to. Now, broadening the scope of elements you have access to, the advantage of that is pretty clear-cut. I had fire before, I have fire and earth now, I have more options at my disposal. However, if you choose an option that allows you to really focus in on a particular element, That's where the impulse and gate junctions are going to come in. At first level, depending on your choices, you may get what's called an impulse junction, which is a special ability that you can activate anytime that you use a 2-action impulse inside of combat. As a quick example, the air impulse junction, anytime you use an air impulse ability, such as a 2-action air elemental blast, you would get a free 5-foot step either before or after you use that impulse. The specific impulses are obviously going to vary by the element that you choose, but essentially any impulse junction is just kind of an extra buff that you get on top of your normal abilities because you've chosen to specialize in that particular element. Gate junctions are choices that can show up at higher levels that again reflect the fact that you have chosen to specialize in a particular element. When you choose a gate junction, you can always choose one of the impulse junctions that was available at first level. Additionally, you can choose gate junctions in 4 different categories. One category adds special effects when you land a critical hit. The next category gives you resistance to elemental damage. You can also pick up a gate junction that adds an effect to your kinetic aura. And finally, you can get a gate skill junction, which is going to give you a skill feat and some other effect associated with one of your skills. Essentially, you can look at impulse and gate junctions together as sort of 5 different elementally specific bonus powers that you get from taking the time to specialize in a particular element. Again, there's a ton of options here. We're not going to dig into all of them. They're just the perks of specialization. The final ability that I'd like to point out for the Kineticist is a bit of a higher level ability. Normally I don't focus in on these for classes, but this is one that I really think is worth calling out, and that is the Reflow Elements ability that is available at 11th level. And this is a variant retraining ability that is available to the Kineticist that essentially allows you to take one of your elemental impulses and replace it with another impulse of the same element that would be a legal choice for your character. So if you have one particular metal impulse and you want to switch it out for another metal impulse, you can totally do that, and you can do that much quicker than the normal retraining rules would allow. And if you've seen this series of videos, you know that I strongly recommend taking advantage of retraining rules when you see them, so don't sleep on Reflow Elements. This could be a powerful option that you have access to. Are we out of the key terms and concepts? Finally. Time to move on to question number 4. What are the strengths of the Kineticist? Now, for a class that has 6 different elemental options and multiple particular choices you can make under each element, the strengths of the Kineticist are honestly going to vary a lot by the choices you make. And when we get to the build options section, we'll kind of talk about what each element leans towards, but do be aware that the strengths of the Kineticist will vary based on the particular choices that you take. That being said, there are a few things about the Kineticist that I think are worth highlighting. Number 1, I'm not even going to talk about mechanics here, I just want to talk about the incredible flavor of the Kineticist. The Pathfinder 1st edition Kineticist had a lot of flavor, but the mechanics made the class hard to approach for me. The Pathfinder 2e feels like they took the excellent flavor of the 1e version of this class, ramped it up even farther, and then made it so accessible that it makes the Kineticist a very compelling class for me. This class really nails the fantasy of a master of elemental magic. It does it really, really well. And while there's some complexity to this class, I really think that this class manages to deliver exactly what you're looking for if you're trying to go for this style of character. This class really is a pure flavor win on so many different levels. Like, even if you don't want to play a Kineticist, just read through some of the impulse options and see if you are not laughing hysterically. One of my favorite options allows you to summon the equivalent of a giant Venus flytrap to snap your enemies. There's just a lot of really fun stuff here, and it's all really, really well done. Paizo nailed that flavor to mechanics crossover, in my opinion, perfectly on this class. However, diving into specific mechanical strengths, One of the first things I want to talk about is, for the most part, the Kineticist has really good offense. Now, the particular element you choose will determine exactly how strong your offense is. The Fire Kineticist is the damage king, while other elements are more defensive in nature. But in general, this is a blaster or striker style class, and it is geared very heavily towards combat and offensive abilities. And if you're the person who likes to bring the heat, metaphorically or literally, to the battlefield, this class certainly has the ability to do that. Elemental Blast is a very flexible ability that allows you to tailor your attacks to what's best in the situation. You have lots of class impulse feats that can give you access to an incredible variety of options. You can really bring a lot of unique, interesting, and powerful attacks to the battlefield. The Kineticist has a good offense, and it's something you're going to enjoy. Another interesting strength of the Kineticist is they are more durable than their totally not a caster status might seem at first glance. They have a base D8 hit dice, which any caster is thankful if that's what they get to bring to the table. Then they use Constitution as their primary stat, so they're going to get a pretty nice bonus to hit points at every level. And on top of that, they eventually get legendary proficiency in Fortitude saves. The Kineticist is a fairly durable class. Now, apart from certain metal Kineticist specific impulses, they're not going to be walking around in heavy armor or its equivalent, so they don't have the same durability as a class like the Champion or the Barbarian, but for a blaster style class, they come with a pretty decent ability to take a hit, and that is honestly something that I think is very enjoyable. A final thing worth noting is, because Kineticists are not spellcasters and they're not using spells, their magic is essentially unlimited. They might have to spend actions channeling elements to get their aura up and going, but once their aura is up and going, they can use Elemental Blast over and over and over again without restriction. And yes, they have Overflow abilities that can shut their Elemental Blast off, but if they spend an action to channel elements again, that energy is right back and available for them to use, meaning that when you look at the Kineticist throughout the adventuring day, they maintain their ability to bring that offensive power to the table consistently from encounter to encounter to encounter. They don't run out of resources like traditional spellcasting classes might. But no class is perfect, so let's move on to question number 5 in this series and ask, what are the weaknesses of the Kineticist? And I'd like to start with a very important weakness. The Kineticist is not subtle. In any way, shape, form, or fashion, the Kineticist is one of those classes that cannot hide what they are doing, and if you are playing a Kineticist, everybody knows what you're up to. Remember, to access any of your abilities, your kinetic aura must be active, and that kinetic aura is a 10-foot radius of elemental magic swirling around you, clearly demonstrating that you are channeling the magic of the elemental planes. Man, I wonder who's setting everything on fire. Now, longtime fans of this channel may know that I don't particularly enjoy subtle characters in TTRPGs. Generally speaking, I don't like playing a rogue because I don't want to be sneaking around. I like being loud and bombastic, and I want to be the center of attention. So for me, subtlety is not a particularly important part of the TTRPG experience, but if you want to play a character who is more clandestine, if you want to play a character who can influence the world without being noticed, Kineticist is not the class for you. All of their abilities require them to be pretty obvious when they're using them. This is going to transfer to the next notable weakness of the Kineticist class, which is Kineticist is arguably one of the worst 3 classes in the game when it comes to skills. I'm honestly not sure if the War Priest, the Druid, or the Kineticist takes last place in this regard for me. I could see arguments for all 3, but when it comes to the various options in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, when it comes to skill game, the Kineticist is not going to be very good, and part of this goes back to your key attribute is Constitution. Constitution is great for giving you a good hit point pool, for making your impulse attack rolls really strong. Inside of combat, the Kineticist has a ton of options, but when it comes to skills, no skills are tied directly to Constitution, meaning your best ability is not going to be tied to any skill in the game. Sure, you can still train up some skills, but those skills are going to be associated with secondary or possibly even tertiary abilities on your character sheet. Pair this together with the fact that many of your class abilities might work directly against your skills, and that can further hinder your skill game. For example, I feel like pretty much every stealth check ever is destined for failure if you have your kinetic aura active. Back in the key terms and concepts section, I did mention that there are some options that kineticists have that can improve their skill game a little bit in the form of gate junctions that address their skills. It will give them some skill feats, it will give them some bonuses with particular skills, and I want to go ahead and say here, I've seen a lot of commentary that says that the skill-focused gate junctions are not very good, and if I'm being honest, I kind of agree with that commentary. There are some options to bring a little more skill game to the Kineticist, but even those options, when you look at them, end up feeling lackluster compared to other classes in Pathfinder 2e. Kineticist, at the end of the day, is not a class you want to play if the skills of Pathfinder 2e are super important to you. By the way, tagging onto this point, while it's not technically a skill, Kineticists also cap out at expert proficiency for perception, so they're also going to be limited in that regard. Another thing that hurts the skill game of the Kineticist indirectly, but is also its own standalone weakness, is what's known as multiple attribute dependency. Some classes can function with a really strong score in a single ability or maybe just two abilities. However, other classes find that they need a strong array of abilities kind of across the board in order to truly be effective, and one of the things you will note in a lot of TTRPGs, Pathfinder included, is that classes that gear very heavily towards being in combat, those are classes that are going to be MAD the most often. As a Kineticist, you're going to need a good ability for Constitution, because that's going to power your elemental magic, so that's a good thing for this class. But if you want to use melee elemental blasts at all, you're going to need a good strength. And since most versions of the Kineticist are going to rely on light armor, that also means you probably want a really good dexterity, leaving most of your mental abilities as tertiary picks for this character. A final weakness, and this is a little bit of a minor one, but I still want to mention it, the Kineticist really doesn't do a lot with gear. Because of your impulses and because of Elemental Blast, you are basically never going to be using a weapon. In fact, one of the few complaints I have about the Kineticist is they don't really have a way to blend your Elemental Blast with weapon strikes. That's something I'd like to see in the future. But essentially you don't really have a weapon, and a lot of the other gear that might be associated with more combat-oriented characters, it's just not something that you're going to use. Pathfinder has a lot of creative gear in it, and there's a lot of fun items that characters can potentially access, but the Kineticist kind of carries their kit with them in the form of their elemental gate, so at the end of the day, gear just kind of becomes a non-issue for you. In some ways it's a strength because you're not super reliant on it, but in other ways it becomes a weakness because you lose out on opportunities to really take advantage of it. But okay, let's move on to question number 6 and talk about what is honestly the most fun portion of any of these conversations, and that is the build options that the Kineticist gives you. The Kineticist, in a fashion similar to some of my other favorite classes in Pathfinder 2e, takes what I like to call a build-your-own subclass approach, in that it has several different pieces, and you kind of get to pick which pieces you want, and then assemble them together in a way that is unique to your character. I like it when classes are designed like this. Paizo, anytime you throw this in a product, I'm going to be a fan, and the Kineticist really highlights one of the reasons that this design can be so much fun, and also, with this particular class, quite practical. Essentially, you can think of the Kineticist as answering two separate questions. The first question is, how many elements can I access? And then the second question is, which elements do I choose? Starting at first level, you're going to have a very simple choice. Do I want to have a single elemental gate, or do I want to have a dual elemental gate? Regardless of which choice you pick, you're going to get two impulse feats, so two elemental abilities that come with your gate, but if you pick a single gate, then you're going to pick a single element and then choose two particular impulse feats under that element. However, if you take the dual gate, you're going to pick two elements, and one impulse feat will come from the first element you pick, and the second impulse feat will come from the other. So, for example, if I have a single gate for the wood element, I would pick two wood impulse feats to go along with that gate. However, if I took the fire and air dual gate, then I would have one fire impulse feat and one air impulse feat as a result. Choice number one is that single versus dual gate option, and then past that the variety is the specific elemental combinations that you choose. However, the Kineticist does offer some incentive if you want to specialize or focus. As I mentioned before, you have options known as impulse or later gate junctions that come into play if you choose to specialize. So, at first level, if you choose to specialize in that single element, you get an extra effect called an impulse junction that comes into play anytime you use a two-action impulse of that element. So, for example, let's say you went single gate and chose metal as your element of choice. You would get an impulse junction tied to metal anytime you use a two-action metal impulse. As a kicker effect, you would have the option to coat yourself in acid, electricity, or spikes and deal acid, electricity, or piercing damage to any creature that tries to grab you or touch you in melee, that kind of thing. Every element has its own unique impulse effects, and you'll have to read through those to see what they are, but as we've previously mentioned, the choice to specialize in an element is going to come with some pretty nice kicker effects on top of that specialization. After first level, you get to play around with your elemental gate again at 5th level and every 4 levels after that. So at 5th level, 9th level, 13th level, and 17th level, you are going to have another choice that you make called Expand the Portal or Fork the Path, and essentially you are repeating the choice you made at first level. If you expand the portal, you can take any element that you have already chosen, that you already have access to, and you improve your connection to that element. Or you can fork the path, which opens your elemental gate to an additional elemental plane, adding another option to your collection. By the way, the choices you've made at previous level don't control the choice you have to make here. If you specialize in one element at first level, you can still fork the path at level 5, adding a second element to what you have access to. Conversely, if you went dual gate at first level, at 5th level you could choose to expand the portal and choose one of those pre-existing elements and focus in on it, specialize in on it a little bit more than that secondary option that you have. Every time this choice comes up, you can go either way. There are no restrictions. This means that on one extreme, you could have a character that has specialized in a single element every single stage of their career, unlocking more and more gate junctions, elemental specializations along the way. The only thing they may know how to do is conjure the element of water, but they know all of the tricks for conjuring the element of water. On the other extreme, you could have a character that, by level 17, has access to every single elemental option inside of the game. However, they've never specialized in any of the elements, meaning they don't have access to any of the impulse or gate junctions, so while they have a wide variety of options at their disposal, they're never going to be any stronger in particular options. Most characters are going to land somewhere in between, where they've got some specialization maybe in one or two elements, and then they have a couple of elements that they can't access. But every time this class feature comes up, that's the choice you get to make. Do I want to dig in and specialize more in a particular element, or do I want to open up new options? From there, let's talk in very generic terms about the elements themselves. There are 6 elements available to the Kineticist: air, earth, fire, water, wood, and metal. Each of these are going to lend themselves to particular playstyles, but really and truthfully, if some of these appeal to you, you're going to want to go in and read some of the specific options that are available to kind of understand the full scope of what they can do. We're just talking about the generic options here. The element of air focuses a lot on hit and run style tactics, meaning that if you imagine a character that's hard to pin down, that's hard to catch, if you imagine a character who really likes to focus on the ranged elemental blast that we talked about earlier, the air element is really good for that playstyle. Unsurprisingly, the earth element is the reverse. Rather than focusing on hit and run, it focuses more on durability options and also has a lot of terrain manipulation abilities that they can use to kind of control the battlefield. The element of fire for the Kineticist is the most niche, most narrow of the elements, but it's also the element that its playstyle is pretty obvious. It's the pure damage choice. If you enjoy a playstyle where you can just tag on multiple instances of bonus damage and see how high you can stack the damage up, fire is the element for you. Metal as an element is going to play similar to earth in that it's very durability focused, but where it seems to differentiate itself from the element of earth, metal as an element seems to do a bit of a better job at defending your whole team rather than just yourself. But other than that, it is similar to earth in that it's a very defensive style of element. And then the element of water is going to have a lot of area control and healing options that it can bring to the table. The final element to discuss is the element of wood, and this is your generalist element. It doesn't have the best damage or defense, it doesn't have the best area control, it doesn't have the best healing, but it has a lot of options scattered over these different playstyles, meaning that if you're looking for a Kineticist that has a more well-rounded approach to combat, then wood might be a really effective choice that you can look at. Now, every single element is going to come with 2 pages of dedicated impulse feats just for that element, which exists separate from the actual Kineticist class feats that you're also thinking about. There are a lot of options here, which kind of begs the question, if I don't know what I want, how do I best decide which way to go? My suggestion is this. Start on the Composite Impulses page. There are some pages that are dedicated to special impulses that mix multiple elements. So you have options for air and fire, or you have options for water and wood, and you can go through and see what kind of special attacks are available for impulses that combine multiple elements. If you're interested in playing a Kineticist, I think that's actually the easiest way to decide how should I weave my way through character creation. If you look at the composite impulses, you can identify which specific elements you're going to need in order to pick up those impulses, and then once you have the list of the elements you're going to need, from there you can decide which ones you want to specialize in. For example, let's imagine I want to build a Kineticist who has the Lava Leap impulse and the Living Bonfire impulse. Lava Leap requires that I have access to earth and fire, and Living Bonfire requires access to fire and wood. Meaning that, over the course of my career, I'm going to need access to earth, fire, and wood in order to obtain both of those abilities. Thus, at first level, I might dual gate into earth and fire, and then at 5th level I might fork the path to wood so that I have access to all the elements I need. And then, once I have all the elements I need, I might then start specializing in a particular element to give me some extra advantages. In the particular example I just gave, since both of those impulses are tied to fire, I might choose to specialize in fire, since it seems like fire abilities are going to be a little bit more common in the overall suite of what I have available. Now, before I leave build options, there's one final thing I want to say in regards to super specialized Kineticists. If you're playing the kind of character that really wants to go all in on a particular element or wants to focus very heavily on a particular element, there is a Kineticist class feat that I strongly recommend. There's a first level Kineticist class feat called Versatile Blasts that adds additional damage options to your elemental blast, and if you are heavily specialized, that is a way to add a little more flexibility to your character. I think it's a very useful class option to help offset the dangers of being over-specialized in a single element. But that segues nicely into the final question for this video. Question number 7, how can I get the most out of the Kineticist? Now honestly, we've hit several tips along the way. We've talked about how this is a blaster class, that it has a lot of durability, that it maintains its strength from combat to combat, and if you lean into the combat side of your character, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of it. We've talked about that this is a class that struggles with skills, and so if you're looking at a Kineticist, you're probably going to need to consider other options of your build to round out the skill package for your character. I recommend looking at some of the skill-focused ancestry feats. If you're looking at a Kineticist build, that will help cover for those issues. We've hit a lot of ideas along the way, but really with the Kineticist, there is one kind of overarching piece of advice I've seen a lot of places, and I think this is very good advice. Don't build too tall or too wide. There's dangers in both extremes, and unless you really know what you're doing with your build, I recommend avoiding those potential pitfalls. As a Kineticist, you don't have spells, you have impulses. Those impulses are a much smaller list than the list that spellcasters can use. As a result, a Kineticist that goes really heavy all in on a single element is going to find that they can run out of options very quickly, and if you're not careful, you can stumble into a situation where you just don't have any options for the challenge at hand. Conversely, Kineticist is easily a class that can be a mile wide but an inch deep. Sure, you have theoretical access to any ability in the Kineticist class. You've got all of the elements, but you aren't specialized anywhere. You haven't really leaned into one particular aspect of the class. We've mentioned that this is a multiple ability dependent class. If you aren't careful, you're going to spread yourself way too thin. When you are building and developing your Kineticist, you really want to balance between giving yourself some specialization so you have a strong aspect of your character that you can bring to bear in a fight, while also diversifying your options so that you're not locked in and effectively useless in the wrong scenario. Walking the middle path between these two extremes is probably the easiest way to get a positive play experience out of the Kineticist, and that's actually why I gave you that recommendation of starting with the composite impulses. Look at the composites, see which elements you need to get those mixture effects, and then use that as the baseline to pick your specialization, and I think that will naturally help you navigate that dilemma in a pretty effective way. But with that, we have reached the end of our discussion of the Kineticist class for Pathfinder 2e, and the time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about the Kineticist, and do you agree with the overview that I have provided here? Are there strengths of the Kineticist that I have overlooked, or are there weaknesses of the Kineticist that I failed to mention? Also, most importantly, do you have tips on how to play the Kineticist and get some extra mileage out of their abilities? If you do, please jump down to the comment section and share your ideas, because we all have something to learn. As always, please remember the YouTube stuff. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really does mean a lot, and it does encourage me, especially on videos like this that take a lot of work to get done. And as I mentioned, you can also check out my free Discord and my Patreon. Both of those will be linked in the video description as well. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.